Rachel clenched her teeth and gave a mighty tug on the complex arrangement of steel straps and chains that restrained her. The checks were nearly complete, but as a final test, she attempted to pull her arms as far wide of her chest as she could. Satisfied that she could not break free, she collapsed heavily onto the sleeping bag she had laid out for herself on the cold cellar floor. She rubbed her flushed cheeks against the soft, yielding material of the sleeping bag, and although the goose flesh had begun to raise on her slim, naked form, she felt safe and comfortable. She smiled and congratulated herself on her ingenuity. True, she had never shied away from a spot of DIY, but this contraption was truly a thing of her own invention. Her hands and feet were burst bound in 2 matching pairs of strong steel bicycle locks, strong enough to bind delicate human hands but weak enough to snap under just the right amount of pressure. These, in turn, loosely bound her hands to a pair of industrial steel loops which resembled comically large handcuffs. Finally, a long, thick link chain connected both steel loops and had been fed round the back of an ancient and long-defunct iron boiler that took up space against the middle of the interior wall. She had tried to have it removed when she had first bought the house 3 short years ago, but was told the only thing that could get that bulk out of the house was an industrial crane, and even then the front wall of the house would have to be removed. The smile began to fade from her face. She struggled to curl up in a fetal position with the weight of the iron loops weighing down her delicate wrists and legs. She had found them while making a routine trip to the tip after redecorating her bedroom. She had redecorated most of the house after he left. The memory of him made her reach convulsively to her neck and caress the 2 deep indentations formed of well-healed scar tissue just above her collarbone. She had not felt it during the throes of passion. It was only afterwards, when all the adrenaline had diluted back into her blood, that she felt the sting and the warm plasma on her shoulder. He had laughed playfully and lapped it from the hot, moist skin, grinning like a mischievous schoolboy. She didn't know where it came from, but he had been more than willing to accommodate her and sometimes even surpass her in his search for satisfaction. Despite this, it was very consensual and a happy relationship. He was exactly what she had wanted. She didn't even mind his monthly disappearances. She had always said, quite honestly, that it strengthened their bond. He would disappear for 3 or 4 days and return more energized, his libido bigger than ever. But now her home felt cold, sterile, and ultimately uninteresting. She couldn't now recall what had once motivated her to spend so much time on its upkeep. It held no value to her now. Her body was her new obsession. Her hands moved to her belly, which swelled modestly from her slim frame. She linked and cupped her hands under the warm bump and imagined she could feel her baby kicking. It was at this moment her nerves set on fire, and she began to scream. The beast was awake. Rachel's head swam in a dreamlike state of nightmare on reality. She could see the cellar around her, but as if through a cloudy, milky iris. She compared the experience to the hallucinogenic haze of a mushroom trip, mixed with the warm euphoria of an opioid high. She would go where it went, see what it saw, but she had no control. She was merely a passenger now. The wolf began to stand, struggling against its restraints. It placed its gigantic snout against the concrete floor to aid the motion. The wolf looked down and thick ropes of blood-tinted saliva hit the concrete floor with a slap. Feeling its gigantic limbs restricted, it let out a demonic howl that temporarily broke Rachel's paralysis, and a fleeting wave of panic came over her once more. The wolf's howl cracked deafeningly off the walls, and after one last violent pull on the steel link chain, it decided to submit. At least for the moment. It sunk back down on its 4 limbs, sitting like a demonic sphinx, its yellow teeth bared in a permanent snarl. Its amber eyes stared at the cellar door, willing it to open so it could tear warm flesh from bone. Rachel congratulated herself, for this very human woman had single-handedly tamed the powers of hell, and therefore saved her life and the life of the baby inside her. This could work, she thought. Then she slipped into blissful unconsciousness. £22? She exclaimed. Embarrassed and shocked by her convulsive outburst, she looked around to see if she had drawn any unwanted attention. She was relieved to see the shop was still empty. Empty but for the aging owner who propped up the counter. He hadn't seemed to notice. With a sigh, Rachel returned her gaze to the shelves that stocked the expensive but very necessary flexible steel bike locks. She quickly grabbed 8 of them. 2 months' worth, she mused, off the shelves without looking again at the expensive price tag. She had come to this local shop after the big man with the glasses in Halfords had started asking questions as to why she needed so many bike locks. She had just stared blankly at him. She started quickly towards the counter to pay. However, the weight of her baby bump and the strength of the steps sent a sharp, painful sting through her pelvic floor and dissipated to a dull ache in her groin. "Sorry, Angel," she groaned through gritted teeth. She stopped, bracing herself on the seat of a push bike which leant up against the wall. The owner was looking now, his wrinkled eyelids raised in mild concern. She met his gaze. Flicking her brown hair out of her face, she stood straight and walked with false confidence towards the counter, placing the locks down in front of him. He picked them up without a word, one by one, and scanned the barcodes. She averted her eyes as he did so, and with a mild sense of panic, noticed the mid-January sun was rapidly disappearing behind the trees, which waved gently in the breeze. When she turned back to the counter, the owner was holding a white plastic bag containing her purchases in front of her eyes. Taking it from him, she peered round the obstruction to thank him. However, before she could, the inevitable question came. "What do you need so many flexi-locks for?" he asked loudly with a smirk. "You got a fleet or something?" She removed her bank card from her coat pocket and tapped it on the reader, which beeped in response. She looked up at him and said in a sultry voice, "Well, I would show you, but I would kill you." The man flinched as she let out a loud and sustained mocking laugh. He could only stare at her at first, trying to process what he had heard. Then he politely laughed along too and muttered very good." Rachel turned her back and headed towards the door. John Kennedy thought of himself as a rational man. However, even the most rational of individuals could be prone to the occasional hallucination. More of a simple visual misunderstanding, he assured himself. Although he was concerned and more than a little embarrassed by what he had thought he had witnessed, this would not stop him forevermore telling the story to every customer that would listen of when he met a strange young woman with the burning amber eyes who had laughed maniacally at him and in his own family's business establishment, no less. And that this had happened the night just before the tragedy that had so gripped the newspapers and the public consciousness for years after. Rachel was still chuckling to herself as she walked briskly out of the shop and onto the high street. The cold air kissed her cheeks, and she saw that the sun was almost fully set behind the golden horizon. "Definitely time to get home, Angel," she thought to her baby as she strode towards her car. With each quickened step, her groin stung with the feeling of a phantom knife probing between her bones, but she could not afford to slow down now. She had parked in a disabled parking bay just outside the bar on the high street. Despite not having a blue badge, she had assured herself that no one would be cold-hearted enough to challenge a heavily pregnant woman in winter. On this she had been sorely mistaken. She stepped off the pavement and into the road. Opening the car door, she cautiously sat her bulk down into the driver's side and threw the plastic bag containing the bike locks onto the passenger seat. As soon as she settled, she could tell that something was not right. The car was lopsided. It felt much lower on the passenger side front. Uttering a short, violent exclamation, she began the process of exiting the car again to investigate. She was trying to think away the panic that was gradually enveloping her mind. It's okay, she whispered aloud to herself, but on seeing the flat tyre and the shiny silver steak knife that protruded from it, a bucket of ice was poured over her soul. She was panicking now. There was no getting away from it. She stared angrily into the bar from the pavement. The place bustled with happy patrons blissfully enjoying their Friday afternoon pints. The windows were steamed up beyond any transparency. Her fleeting thoughts of violent retribution on the idiots that had made this attack quickly gave way to an acceptance of the bigger picture. On pain of slaughter and hell's destruction on earth, she must get home, and fast. She finally made it through her front door 45 minutes later, and after a frenzied hobble through the twilight streets, her pelvis and her legs now burning with white-hot pain, and worse, the guilt. How could she have left herself so little time? She had not banked on the car being so cruelly sabotaged. However, she should have gone to the shops earlier. "I'm sorry, my angel," is all she could say through her stifled tears and the burning pain as she rounded the corner of her street. There was no need to shut and bolt the cellar door. She just had to get into her cuffs, and fast. The milky glow of the winter full moon had begun to flood into the cellar through the old cobweb and dirt-encrusted window that looked out into the backyard of the house. As she made her rush descent down the last 2 steps, her foot landed at the wrong angle with an audible crunch, and she fell into her knees, tearing skin under her jeans. The bike lock spilled out of the plastic bag and onto the floor in front of her, and despite the agonizing pain, she began to rip into them with tooth and claw. Still fully clothed and clutching a bike lock between her teeth, she had almost managed to slip the first of the iron rings round her feet when, as sure as death itself, her nerves set on fire once again. She screamed to an uncaring universe until she fainted. Joe Bailey sat in the big armchair in his living room. Both his legs ached from years in the deadest of dead-end jobs. The TV was on, but he couldn't focus on any programme. After the bedtime process and a full day's work before that, he found it difficult to settle his thoughts. He leaned over to the small baby monitor screen that sat on the coffee table. He smiled weakly at the blue night vision image of his beautiful baby girl, who snored gently in a contented sleep. She was wearing her pink sleep suit and a thick zip-up sleep bag that would keep her warm on this cold night. He really had to turn the heating off overnight to keep up with the energy bills. His smile didn't stop a weak sob emerging as a single tear escaped his tired eyes. He was overcome with feelings of love, but also fear. He was 35, and her just 6 months old. Would he live long enough to give her the life that she deserved? Or would he die young and cause her the same pain his father's death had caused him when he was only 17? He softened and told himself that any life is better than no life at all, and life was his gift to her. Switching on the sound function on the monitor, he kissed the screen and placed it back down gently. Joe woke with a start. He had dreamed that he had heard a sharp scraping sound in the room. No, not in the room. Upstairs. He rubbed his eyes and picked up the monitor. His baby lay there still, but there was a shadow that wasn't there before, as if the light from the window was obscured somehow. Had he shut the curtains? He didn't think he had. He put the monitor down and began to stand. At that moment, there was a loud thud from directly above him, and what sounded like a deep bass hum or the growl of a huge dog, but not really like either. He looked down from the ceiling to the monitor, His breathing quickened as he saw that the camera was now completely obscured by a black mass. There was movement. The camera tried to focus. "Hey!" he shouted compulsively as he ran towards the stairs. He was at the top in a matter of seconds. He could hear loud footsteps. He desperately wrestled to open the stair gate, which when locked firmly would stop his curious toddler from falling down the steep staircase. Now it only prevented him from getting to her. He struggled more with the lock. Then, in desperation, he kicked the gate off its hinges, scraping paint and plaster off the walls. He heard his baby start to coo. As he approached the door, a muffled cry of "Dada" slowly rose to a shrill scream as he turned the doorknob and burst into the room. A cold wind rushed in from the bedroom window, which stood wide open. The cot was empty. He first noticed the smell. It was an alien odour. A mixture of farm animals' excrement and the sharp tang of iron you would scent from the taste of blood. He ran panting to the window. He leaned out as far as he could, screaming his daughter's name, tears streaming down his face, and his screams condensing in the freezing night air. Rachel screamed too in her monstrous prison, and the last thing she tasted before she fell into unconsciousness was the warm taste of infant blood and marrow as it passed down her gullet and boiled in her belly. Rachel leaned over the sink in her upstairs bathroom. Warm bile mixed with the semi-digested flesh plastered the inside of the white porcelain bowl. She had to take a break. The urge to purge last night's atrocity had been surpassed by severe faint. She collapsed onto the edge of the bath and held her bump, sobbing loudly. She could taste the child. "Oh God," she thought, "don't let this flesh feed my baby." She stood up again, swallowing another mouthful of table salt from the bottle she had snatched from her kitchen on her way up from the cellar. She felt a large surge coming up from her stomach. She leaned over the sink and vomited afresh. Her throat burned as she gagged on something hard and unyielding. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She reached into her mouth to dislodge the object. She pulled hard. 2 tiny snap ribs, attached to half a sternum, clattered into the sink. It had been a week since his baby had been snatched from the safety of her cot. The police had responded quickly to Joe's hysterical call. When he failed to answer the door, they had entered the house by force. About 10 minutes later, after securing the house for the forensic unit, an investigating officer had found him kneeling in the wooded meadow that ran behind the length of the estate, his body convulsing and bare toes turning dark blue from the bite of the winter frost. When questioned in the early hours of the following morning, the young officer would tell his staff sergeant that Mr. Joe England had been fixated to a point in the middle distance, and when he asked what he had seen, Joe had simply whispered, "His eyes. I saw his eyes." His doctor had told him this was likely due to the high dose of benzodiazepines fed to him on his arrival to the hospital. This had helped curb his panic attacks and even helped him achieve a restless sleep. Nothing could help change his waking reality, however, the pain of which hit him like a ton of ice whenever he regained consciousness. Joe was sat in the armchair, swallowing his 4th daily dose of diazepam, when he heard the soft knock at his front door. He glanced up at the clock, which showed exactly 10 p.m. He stood up slowly and winced in pain as the blackened tips of his frostbitten toes attempted to take the weight of his body. Most likely the police, he thought. They attended to check in daily, but never this late. He no longer eagerly anticipated their arrival. After a week of search and little to no forensic leads had left him in despair. Now, if expecting anything, he expected the worst. The knock came again as he entered the hall and he opened the door. The young woman who stood there withdrew her hand from the door panel and stared nervously at him for a long beat, before Joe finally spoke. "Yes, what is it?" Joe reached out before she could answer, to rip off a frayed strand of police tape that still stuck to the front door. He screwed it up into a ball and threw it coldly into the neighbour's front garden. When he turned back, the slim woman wearing a long green coat and matching scarf still hadn't answered him. She stared at him, breathing nervously, her warm breath condensing in the freezing air. "You from the constabulary?" he asked blankly. "No," she answered, finally. "I'm your neighbour. I live in the big house on Vincent Avenue just there." She gestured to the street behind her. As she turned back, he noticed she was carrying a bulging plastic shopping bag. Inside, he could see it contained at least one or more black bin liners. He could tell by the way she held it that it had some weight. "What do you want?" he asked blankly. "Because I've had all the sympathy I can take for 1 week. I'd rather just be left alone, thank you." He began to close the door slowly, but before he could move it, she raised her booted foot and wedged it in the door jamb. Joe looked at her quizzically. Her eyes pleaded with him even before she spoke. "No," she shouted abruptly. "I need to talk to you. Let me in. Please." Joe paused for a moment. Something about her manner intrigued him, and he immediately softened. He released his hold on the door and let it swing open. She followed him in, shutting the door quickly behind her. The house was cold. Rachel noticed this straight away. Cards and ready meals covered the kitchen table, although many of them lay unopened and uneaten. Joe grabbed a blanket from the living room and sat himself down heavily on the kitchen table. "Yes, well, what is it?" he barked. She ignored his question. Gently and with care, she raised the bag she carried and placed it in the middle of the table. When its bulk had settled, she slowly removed her hand from it. Cocking her head to one side and swallowing hard, she gave the shiny polythene one gentle caress and moved away. She seemed to be fighting back tears, he thought. She moved back to the head of the table and looked at the floor. Joe stared at her incredulously. "You don't know me, Joe, but I know you," she said with effort. "I've seen you before. Out there." She gestured to the dark trees that could be seen out of the kitchen windows. "When?" he asked. A look of pure confusion overtook the sadness on his face for a moment. "I'm sorry, Joe. I'm so sorry. I thought I had it under control. She broke off and began to sob uncontrollably as Joe rose to his feet, the warm blanket dropping from his shoulders onto the cold floor. "It can't be you," Joe pleaded. "I saw his eyes, or I don't know what I saw, but if you think this is funny or you coming here is going to help me somehow." She looked up. She looked directly at him. His rapidly beating heart slowed and was replaced by an icy chill that stabbed like knives all over his body as he stared into the woman's eyes. Amber eyes. Those very eyes that had haunted his every waking moment for the last 7 days. "You?" he croaked through his weakened throat. He was too scared to be angry. His head began to spin and the kitchen floor began to slant. He fell heavily back into his chair. Using the tabletop to steady his fall, his fingertips kneaded the edge of the bag the woman had brought. It was icy cold, yet soft and yielding to the touch. His back hit the chair hard, and he reconnected with the eyes of this monster who stood before him. Before Joe could say or do anything more, Rachel reached slowly into her side coat pocket and removed a long, thin kitchen knife. It was beautifully ornate, solid silver with gold gilding hallmarked on the handle. Her grandmother had left it to her along with an inheritance that allowed her to secure a mortgage on her house. The house she would have only a few short months ago strived to make a home, raise her child, and live happily until the day she died. The knife and the house now made her sick to behold. and she felt nothing but a cold and certain clarity about what she had to do. The curse had been manageable until it wasn't. The beast would out. It was only a matter of circumstance and damage limitation. She could not live like that, and she would not let that be her child's fate. Joe recoiled from the woman, a look of confusion on his face as she slowly began to approach the table. The light of the street light shone through the kitchen window and glinted off the knife as she turned it in her hands. To his surprise, she reached out and offered him the handle. He paused. She waited. Joe took the knife carefully, though with quivering hands, and asked the only question. "Where is she? Where's my baby?" The answer came in the form of a look, as her eyes moved down to the bulging plastic bag that adorned the table. Joe looked down at the obscene bundle. "No," he pleaded through wet, bloodshot eyes. He stood swiftly, pushing her out of his way. She stepped back politely, her eyes fixed into the middle distance as he frantically ripped at the layers of polythene plastic. An obscene version of a child's party game unfolded as Joe desperately tried to reveal the bag's contents. Joe finally removed the last layer, and a stench of dank death filled the kitchen. Despite the overpowering smell, Joe leaned in closer to inspect its contents. He saw what the bag contained. At that moment, something in Joe's DNA changed forever. He felt as if a diamond, compressed by the forces of the Earth's immeasurable pressure, had splintered into 1,000 sharp fragments in his brain. He turned on the woman. Rachel closed her eyes and spread her arms, palms facing upwards. She allowed a small smile of relief to appear on her gently quivering lips as Joe lunged, plunging the knife straight into her belly. He twisted the blade and guided it upwards with extraordinary strength. The tip of the blade found her heart, and something unspeakable left the world forever.